The morning air hung heavy inside the base as soldiers moved through the halls with crisp efficiency, yet no one paid attention to the quiet single dad walking beside the row of offices carrying a stack of maintenance reports he had been asked to deliver, and his steps were steady, but his eyes scanned the surroundings with a familiarity he never let others see, leaving a question in the air of why a man like him moved with such silent confidence entered the main building without hesitation, passing groups of officers who barely acknowledged him, for to them he was just another civilian contractor, another man with grease on his sleeves and weariness in his face, and he kept his expression calm even though he felt the weight of old instincts tugging inside him, as if sensing something was about to shift, leaving him wondering how long he could keep his past buried. As he approached the secured wing, his posture subtly changed, his shoulders straightening, his breathing slowing into the measured rhythm he had learned years ago in a life he never spoke of, and though the soldiers guarding the doors glanced at him dismissively, he caught the faint whir of new scanners installed overnight, and the accuracy of their placement told him someone higher up was expecting something unusual, leaving his curiosity sharpening with every step inside the corridor. The atmosphere was thick with tension, conversations cut short as officers rushed between rooms holding classified folders under their arms, and the single dad noticed every detail: the hurried posture, the coded colors on the door frames, the subtle shift in tone that meant a major operation was underway, yet nothing in their movements prepared him for the moment when his badge granted him access to the briefing room, leaving him with an uneasy sense that someone wanted him there. The door slid open, and the chatter inside fell into a sudden silence as the single dad stepped across the threshold, and dozens of eyes turned his way, confusion crossing their faces, for no one expected a maintenance worker to enter a room reserved for high-ranking officials and special operations teams, and he felt the familiar pull of instinct telling him this was more deliberate than accidental, leaving him wondering who had put his name on the access list. The room was filled with generals, colonels, analysts, and elite operatives gathered around a massive display showing satellite images of an unknown location, and their conversation had been urgent, judging by the way they leaned over the table, but now they stared at him as if someone had interrupted a classified operation, and the single dad felt the pressure of recognition hovering just beyond their confusion, leaving him tense yet unreadably. Own general at the front of the room frowned, looking down at a roster on his tablet, and his eyes widened for the briefest moment before he raised his head again, staring at the single dad with shock that he tried to suppress, and the officers nearby leaned closer, curious about the sudden shift in the general's expression, leaving everyone wondering what the man in greasy coveralls had done to warrant such a reaction. The single dad took one step farther into the room, and for a moment he felt time tighten around him, as if every breath in the room held still, waiting, and he noticed the briefing materials on the wall, the mission profile, the danger level, the markers he recognized from a world he had left behind long ago, yet seeing them stirred something deep inside him, leaving him wondering if the past he avoided was about to catch up. The general who led the meeting straightened slowly, his chair scraping back across the floor, and every officer in the room went rigid, confused by their commander's reaction, for generals did not get startled easily, and they certainly did not shift to attention over a maintenance worker, yet something in the single dad's presence had struck a chord that none of them understood, leaving an uneasy hush lingering in the air. The general stepped forward, stopping only a few feet away, and everyone braced for reprimand, expecting him to order the maintenance worker out, but instead he looked at the single dad with an expression that held recognition, respect, and something deeper, something known only to men who had survived impossible missions side by side, leaving the officers baffled at a dynamic they had never seen before. The single dad met the general's gaze calmly, his eyes steady, his demeanor quiet but unshakable, and though his clothes were simple, his posture radiated something that did not belong to an ordinary civilian, a kind of gravity reserved for those who had shaped history from shadows, and his silence said more than any explanation could, leaving the general visibly moved by a memory only he seemed to recall, and then in a motion that froze the entire room the general straightened, his back lifted, his hand and delivered a crisp salute toward the single dad, not hesitant, not uncertain, but with the full formality of military honor and protocol, and the officers around them gasped, unable to understand why their highest-ranking commander had just saluted. A man they believed insignificant leaving the room suspended in shock. The single dad stood still, not returning the salute, not out of disrespect, but because his mind was racing with the implications of what the general's reaction meant, and he wondered who had revealed his presence, who had brought his identity back to the surface after years of isolation, and why the general would choose this moment in front of this audience to acknowledge him, leaving him questioning what new danger had forced such recognition. A very officer waited breathlessly, their eyes darting between the general and the single dad, trying to comprehend what history lay between them, and the general lowered his hand slowly, his expression heavy with the weight of secrets, and he spoke the single dad's real name in a near whisper, a name no one in the room had heard before, a name that did not appear on any contractor roster, leaving a wave of realization rising among the confused soldiers. Single dad felt old memories rush through him, uninvited images of operations buried deep in classified archives, missions never spoken of outside the highest circles, and he knew instantly that something catastrophic must be happening for the general to break silence so publicly and reveal knowledge that should have remained hidden, leaving a sense of impending danger pressing against his ribs. The general turned to the room, announcing that the single dad's presence was not only authorized but required, and that no one was to question his involvement, and the officers exchanged bewildered glances, whispering among themselves, trying to understand why their commander spoke with such urgency, but none dared challenge him, for the general's tone carried the authority of someone who knew the stakes, leaving tension tightening inside every corner of the room. The screen at the center flashed again, revealing new satellite images that made the general's voice turn grim, and the single dad recognized the markers instantly, the coordinates, the formation, the signatures he had seen only on missions that had changed national security forever, and he understood with a sinking feeling that he alone in the room knew exactly what they were looking at, leaving him with no choice but to step closer. Took another quiet step forward, and every operative instinct he had tried to suppress for years snapped awake, the way they had in jungles, deserts, and war zones where survival depended on the slightest shift in sound or shadow, and he felt the weight of this briefing unfolding like a past he thought he had escaped, creeping back with relentless force, leaving him bracing for the next revelation. The general cleared his throat and gestured for the single dad to join him at the front of the room, and the officers stepped aside, reluctantly making space, as if unsure whether they were witnessing a breach in protocol or the arrival of someone far beyond their rank, and the single dad felt their stares burning through him, but he kept his focus sharp, for he knew the mission on the screen was no accident, leaving him prepared for a truth far more dangerous. As he approached the display, the images sharpened, revealing a location he knew too well, a place he had hoped never to see again, for it held memories of betrayal, survival, and secrets too dark for public knowledge, and the color drained from his face as the significance of the intel finally settled in, leaving him breathless under the weight of what it implied, and aware that the mission they faced was far from routine. Officers waited for direction, unaware that the single dad was the only one in the room who had first-hand knowledge of the enemy they were facing, and the general watched him silently, seeking confirmation of the threat. And when the single dad finally nodded even slightly, the general's expression hardened, for he knew that the situation was worse than he had feared, leaving the room steeped in growing dread. Single dad turned slowly to face the operatives, and their confusion shifted into tension as they realized his presence was not symbolic but necessary, and though they did not yet know the details, they sensed that the next words spoken would change everything about the mission ahead. Leaving their breaths held in anticipation, looked at the general with unspoken understanding, and the general gave him a slight nod, granting permission for him to speak, and the single dad faced the room, his voice quiet but steady, as he began to recount details of a past mission classified beyond their clearance, and the officers leaned forward, trying to grasp the magnitude of what he was revealing, leaving them stunned at the scope of the danger they were being drawn into, but before he could continue, an alarm sounded in the hallway, echoing through the walls, and the lights began to shift from white to red, signaling an emergency alert and the entire room. The moment the alarms began to echo through the walls, the briefing room erupted into controlled chaos, soldiers rushing to their stations, analysts scrambling to identify the breach, and the general issuing rapid orders that everyone struggled to process, while the single dad stood perfectly still, absorbing the unfolding data with the calm precision of someone who had lived through this exact pattern before, leaving the room wrapped in a suffocating tension as everyone waited for his reaction. Stepped toward the display, his eyes narrowing as the feed updated in real time, showing the perimeter sensors tripped in a sequence too deliberate to be random and too synchronized to be the work of amateurs, and he recognized the tactical signature instantly, for it mirrored the exact method of infiltration used years ago by the rogue unit that had been presumed destroyed, though he alone knew they had never truly vanished, leaving the officers staring at the screen with growing dread as they realized something far more dangerous was approaching. The general moved beside him, trying to decipher the information, but even he could not match the speed with which the single dad processed the threat, his mind running through every pattern, every past encounter, every detail he had spent years trying to forget, and though the room buzzed with frantic voices, he felt only the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat as he stepped forward, because he knew the breach was not testing the base, it was targeting him, leaving the realization sharp and unavoidable. He took one long breath and addressed the general in a low voice, saying that the enemy they faced did not attack without purpose, and if they had come here, they were not after weapons or data, but after a loose thread from their past, a thread that only he represented, and the general absorbed this with grim understanding, for he had always suspected the single dad carried more than a forgotten history, and now that truth was rising to the surface, leaving every officer watching with uneasy. Screens flickered again, revealing heat signatures moving with deliberate formation across the outer fence line, their precision unmistakable, and the single dad stepped closer, analyzing their spacing, their posture, their timing, each detail confirming his fear that these were not ordinary infiltrators, but remnants of an elite rogue faction once tied to the deepest operations of their government. And the room fell into a heavy silence as they realized they were facing a threat none of them had been trained to fight, leaving the atmosphere thick with uncertainty. Moved toward the tactical table, scanning the layout of the base, knowing exactly where the infiltrators would strike first, and he explained in a controlled voice that they were attempting a silent breach to capture, not destroy, expecting to extract information through force before anyone could respond. Yet, what they did not realize was that he was no longer the same operative they once tried to erase, leaving his confidence simmering beneath his quiet tone. The general ordered the SEAL teams to mobilize, but the single dad shook his head, saying they were not prepared for the enemy's strategy, that every soldier who engaged would be outmatched unless they understood the tactics of this rogue faction. And the officers glanced at each other, uncertain whether to trust him. Yet they could sense that he spoke with a knowledge earned through scars and survival, leaving their dependence on him growing by the second. Moved swiftly toward the weapons locker, entering a code no one expected him to know, and retrieving gear he had not touched in years, gear that fit his hands like a memory returning with brutal clarity. And as he tightened the straps on his vest, the SEALs watched with quiet disbelief, realizing that the unassuming single dad before them had once lived a life in the shadows of the most dangerous missions, leaving their assumptions about him unraveling completely. Outside, the sirens grew louder, signaling that the enemy had breached the outer perimeter, and the base locked down its gates, sealing everyone inside for the impending confrontation. And the single dad stepped to the door, scanning the hallway, listening to the subtle shift in the air that told him the infiltrators were moving with deadly efficiency, and he knew they were closing in faster than the base could respond, leaving him with no room for hesitation. General approached, asking him directly what their true objective was, and the single dad explained quietly that years ago the rogue faction had attempted to steal classified intelligence, but when he intervened and exposed their operation, he became the last surviving witness to their crimes, and they had spent years hunting him through the shadows of his civilian life, and their presence here now meant they had finally traced him to the base, leaving the general stunned by the weight of this revelation. Walked down the hallway with silent steps, his senses sharp enough to detect every vibration, every faint echo, and he motioned for the SEALs to stay back, telling them the infiltrators were expecting resistance but not expecting him, and that the element of surprise rested entirely on the fact that they believed he had disappeared from the world, and the SEALs reluctantly obeyed, understanding that this man knew more about the enemy than any of them could comprehend. Leaving the hallway filled with silent anticipation ahead of him, the lights flickered, signaling tampering with the power grid, a classic tactic meant to disorient defenders, and he recognized the pattern, instantly turning sharply toward an engineering corridor, where he knew the infiltrators would attempt to disable communications, and his footsteps quickened, though his breathing remained steady, for he had walked into situations far worse than this and survived, leaving him fueled by determination and memory. As he neared the corridor, he saw shadows moving with practiced coordination, and he pressed himself against the wall, observing their movements, their grips on their weapons, the rhythm of their steps, each detail matching perfectly with the rogue faction he had once fought, and the sight stirred an old fire in him, a force he had buried deep beneath years of quiet fatherhood, leaving him aware that he could no longer hide what he truly was. Stepped into the corridor, silently approaching from behind as the infiltrators worked on the junction box, and he studied their gear, their insignias, their positions, and he sensed something more disturbing than he expected, for these were not merely remnants of a shattered group, but highly trained operatives, upgraded, evolved, and prepared with new resources that suggested a powerful hand had revived their unit, leaving him questioning who else had become involved with it. Hesitation, he moved with sudden speed, intercepting the nearest operative with a swift motion that sent him crumpling soundlessly to the floor, and the remaining infiltrators spun around, but too slowly for someone who had once been the most unpredictable agent on the field, and he disarmed the next attacker with precise fluidity, forcing them back down the corridor where the shadows consumed them, leaving the base momentarily safe, but the danger far from resolved. SEALs caught up moments later, stunned by how quickly he had neutralized the threat, and one of them asked how many more operatives were expected, but the single dad shook his head, saying that this was only the first wave of distraction designed to pull forces away from the true objective, and that the enemy would be pushing toward a classified vault deeper inside the base, where files about past covert units were stored. Leaving the SEALs tense with rising concern, led them through the dim halls, moving with certainty as if he had memorized every inch of the base, though he had only been assigned here a short time, and his instincts guided each step toward the heart of the operation, where he knew the rogue unit would strike next, and the base lights continued to flicker under pressure from their sabotage, leaving the atmosphere thick with danger and anticipation. When they reached the vault wing, the air felt colder, the silence sharper, and the single dad signaled for the SEALs to stop because he sensed motion beyond the door, not from the enemy but from base personnel being held hostage, and he realized the infiltrators had anticipated resistance and seized control of the vault room to force the general into surrender, leaving him knowing that negotiation was not an option. Moved toward the door, examining the electronic lock and recognizing instantly that the infiltrators had overridden it with technology similar to what they once used in deep black operations, and he placed his hand against the metal, feeling the faint pulse of energy telling him the system was rigged with a silent alarm that would notify the enemy of any tampering, leaving him calculating a plan in seconds. The SEALs watched in stunned silence as he dismantled the outer casing with precision, disabling components and improvising connections, using only what he carried, and his movements were so fluid that they resembled muscle memory trained through years of repetition, and within moments the door clicked softly, releasing its seal, leaving the SEALs whispering among themselves at the display of expert knowledge inside the room. The lights were dim, and several officers were bound under guard by heavily armed operatives whose faces were hidden behind masks carrying the insignia of the rogue faction, and they turned instantly at The sound of the door opening, but their eyes widened when they saw who had entered because they recognized the man they believed long dead, leaving tension thickening in the narrow room. The leader of the rogue unit stepped forward, his voice low, with disbelief, saying the name of the single dad, not the name on his badge, but the secret name he once carried in the shadows of impossible missions, a name that had shaped he. The moment the rogue leader lifted his weapon, the single dad reacted with instinctive precision, moving faster than any soldier in the room expected, and he closed the distance in a blur, forcing the barrel aside before the shot could fire, and the struggle erupted into a whirlwind of motion, leaving the captive officers watching with wide, fearful eyes as the two men collided like forces that had long been destined to meet again. The rogue operatives opened fire, but the SEALs stormed in from behind, overwhelming them with disciplined force, and the room filled with muffled grunts and heavy footsteps as bodies clashed and weapons skidded across the concrete floor, while the single dad fought with an intensity that none of them had ever seen, revealing glimpses of the warrior he once had been, leaving the scene alive with dangerous energy, and the rogue leader circled around each other, exchanging blows that echoed off the steel walls, each strike fueled by history, by betrayal, by the unfinished battle they had carried for years. And though the rogue leader was strong, he was not driven by the same fire the single dad carried, a fire sharpened by years of protecting a daughter who depended on him alone, leaving his opponent slowly forced backward. The rogue leader lunged, but the single dad redirected the attack, slamming him against a support beam, and for a moment the infiltrator leader staggered, pain flashing in his eyes, and the single dad seized the opening, pressing him down with uncompromising force, demanding to know who had resurrected their faction, who had funded them, equipped them, and tracked him after so many years, leaving his voice quiet and deadly. The leader only smirked, refusing to answer, insisting that the truth would reveal itself soon enough, and that this night was only a prelude to something larger and far more dangerous. And the single dad knew he was not bluffing, for the enemy's movements were too coordinated to be operating alone, leaving dread beginning to coil at the edge of his thoughts. Before he could press the interrogation further, an explosion shook the far side of the base, sending tremors through the floor, and the lights flickered violently, plunging the room into a half-lit haze, while alarms blared overhead, and the single dad realized the rogue unit had triggered a secondary assault meant to force their extraction or destabilize their pursuit, leaving the base thrown back into immediate crisis. SEALs called out over comms, reporting breaches across multiple sectors, and the general demanded a tactical update, but nothing was clear through the static and interference, and the single dad knew the rogue leader had distracted them with the vault attack while the true operation unfolded elsewhere, leaving him with little time to figure out the enemy's intent. Secured the rogue leader in restraints, turning him over to two SEALs with strict orders not to let him out of sight, and he sprinted toward the hallway, feeling the shockwaves still trembling through the walls, and he moved quickly but with calculated steps, listening to the chaos as the base struggled to find its footing under the sudden coordinated attack, leaving him racing toward the unknown. Smoke thickened as he approached the operations wing, flames licking at the far wall where a charge had detonated, and base personnel worked desperately to contain the damage, while digital displays flickered and streamed corrupted data, and he studied the patterns, noting that the blast had not targeted personnel but systems, specifically those linked to intelligence archives, leaving him certain the enemy wanted to erase something critical. Pushed through the smoke, reaching the far control station where two analysts struggled to stabilize the network, and he asked what files had been accessed before the explosion hit, and they told him a single encrypted dossier had been breached, a file locked under the highest clearance Level 1 that only a handful of people had even known existed, and his stomach tightened as he realized what that file contained, leaving him suddenly short of breath. It held records from Deep Shadow operations missions that had never been declassified. Missions carried out by operatives like him, missions that detailed the formation of the rogue faction, the betrayal that had splintered them, and the secret command that once controlled them, and if the enemy had taken those files they now possessed The map to every buried truth, every hidden asset, every loose end, including him, leaving the situation spiraling into greater danger. The alarms shifted tones signaling an airborne breach, and he sprinted toward the hangar, his steps echoing through the long metal corridors as he pieced the enemy tactics together, and he understood now that the base was not their final target, but merely a conduit, a place where history had been stored like a dormant threat waiting to be awakened, and he knew that whatever the rogue faction planned was already in motion, leaving him racing against time. When he reached the hangar, the massive doors were partially open, smoke drifting upward as personnel attempted to seal them, and inside he saw the shape of a stealth aircraft, its engines glowing faintly as rogue operatives prepared for takeoff, and he instantly recognized the model, a prototype long believed to have been scrapped, and its presence here confirmed that someone with enormous power was backing the resurrection of the rogue faction. Leaving him faced with a chilling truth, signaled the SEALs to cover the flanks, and he sprinted across the hangar runway, hearing gunfire erupt from above as enemy snipers tried to slow his advance. But he pushed forward, weaving through the chaos until he reached the landing gear of the aircraft, and he climbed onto the side panel, gripping the metal as the engines roared to life, leaving him hanging on as the craft prepared to lift off. An operative spotted him, shouting a warning as he lunged from inside the hatch, but the single dad pulled himself upward, kicking the attacker back and forcing the hatch half closed, and he pushed through the tight entrance, wrestling the operative into the cargo bay, where shadows flickered across steel walls and the aircraft began to move, leaving him balancing precariously as the floor vibrated beneath him. Inside the bay, he saw the stolen files secured in a shielded case, along with advanced gear that no rogue faction should have possessed, and the sight confirmed his worst fear that a powerful entity had revived their network, giving them access to classified technology and covert assets, and he realized that taking this plane down was the only way to prevent something catastrophic from unfolding, leaving him faced with an impossible choice. Another operative emerged, firing a suppressed weapon, and the single dad rolled behind a crate, grabbing a fallen rifle and returning fire with sharp, precise bursts, forcing the attacker back, and as the aircraft lifted higher, the tilt threatened his footing, yet he pushed forward, grappling with the operative until he forced him into the side panel, knocking him unconscious. Leaving the cargo bay momentarily silent, moved toward the cockpit, knowing the pilot would attempt full ascent within seconds, and if they reached altitude, interception would become nearly impossible, and the plane could vanish into the night sky, carrying secrets too dangerous to be unleashed, leaving him with only moments left to act. When he reached the cockpit hatch, it was sealed and locked digitally, but he entered an override code that even he had not used in years, one he remembered only because the mission it belonged to had been burned into his memory, and the door snapped open, revealing the pilot, a figure masked in tactical gear whose posture spoke of high-level training. Leaving the final confrontation unavoidable, the pilot turned sharply, firing a burst of rounds that shattered the instruments behind him, and the single dad ducked, forcing himself into the tight space, and the two collided violently, grappling for control as the aircraft pitched slightly in midair and the engines strained under the shifting balance, leaving the cockpit a battleground suspended in the sky. As they struggled, the pilot slammed him against the control panel, trying to force him out the hatch, but the single dad struck back, breaking the pilot's grip and twisting him toward the side window, and in the brief flicker of motion he glimpsed something startling, a familiar insignia tattooed on the pilot's wrist, one he had not seen in years, one tied to an underground command he believed dismantled. Leaving him stunned for a split second, the pilot took advantage of the moment, striking him hard and reaching for a hidden blade, but the single dad recovered faster, this time grabbing the pilot's arm and forcing it downward, turning the blade away before slamming the pilot against the seat with a surge of strength fueled by years of buried rage. Leaving the cockpit shaking from the impact, pressed the advantage, pinning the pilot with a decisive move, and with one final strike he incapacitated him, sending him limp across the seat, and the aircraft began to tilt dangerously, the controls unsteady, the alarms blaring as altitude warnings filled the cockpit. Leaving him scrambling to stabilize, the plane slid into the pilot's seat, gripping the controls enforcing the aircraft level fighting against damage from the firefight, and he managed to slow the ascent, but the engines burned irregularly, the stabilization systems flickering from the earlier impact, leaving the plane trembling. In the night sky, he rerouted power, forcing the aircraft into a controlled descent, but the damage was severe and the alarms grew louder, warning that the landing would be rough if not catastrophic, and he guided the craft toward a barren strip beyond. The base, hoping the open ground would reduce the risk of casualties, leaving him with no option but to trust his experience. The aircraft jerked violently as he lowered it, cutting thrust and letting